Hey, I heard there's a new House of the Dragon episode to watch. Let's go check it out. Yo, what the heck is this? Okay, pause. Let's reset. Because seriously, episode 1 of season 3 was not bad. In fact, I actually enjoyed it quite a lot. A lot of people online have been calling it a masterpiece, even saying it's pure cinema. And honestly, I get why people are saying that. I would even go as far as to say this might be the strongest single episode we've gotten in the entire series so far. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. There are still flaws within the episode, some noticeable ones actually. But that's not even my biggest issue right now. My real problem is what comes right after it. Episode 2. Because I don't think I've ever gone from being that excited for a season to being let down that quickly. And I don't mean that as a full judgment of the season as a whole. That's not what this is. I'm not writing it off, but I am saying this. It genuinely took something out of my excitement, and I want to talk about why. So in this video, I'm going to break it down like this. First, I'll talk about what episode 1 actually did right, and why it works so well. Then I'll go into its flaws, because there are some things worth questioning. And after that, I'm going to talk about episode 2, the part that really changed my perspective on where the season might be going. And yeah, we're going to get into all of it. So, let's dive in. At the beginning of episode 1, we're introduced to the wild dragon sheep stealer, as he's doing exactly what his name suggests, eating a sheep. I know I said I was going to start out with the positives, but I have one major criticism about this opening. Shortly after Sheepstealer lands, Rhaena appears almost out of nowhere and decides to try climbing onto the back of one of the most dangerous wild dragons in Westeros. Sheepstealer notices her while he's eating, yet instead of reacting aggressively or flying away, he simply allows her to approach and mount him. From that point forward, the two seem to have formed an immediate bond. The problem is that I don't think the show really earns that moment. Back in season 2, Rhaena spent time searching for Sheepstealer, but never actually did anything that would explain why this notoriously untamed dragon would suddenly trust her. In Fire and Blood, Rhaena repeatedly brings Sheepstealer fresh sheep to eat, gradually building trust over time. It's a simple change, but it's an effective one because it makes the bond feel earned instead of convenient. The show skips that entire process, so what should have been one of the most rewarding Dragon Rider moments instead feels surprisingly easy. That being said, I absolutely love Sheepstealer's design. I honestly think he's one of the coolest dragons we've seen in this series so far. Unlike the more majestic dragons, Sheepstealer looks rough, weathered, and almost neglected. His scarred appearance and discolored scales make him feel less like a royal war machine and more like a stray animal that survived on his own for years. It's a really unique design that instantly separates him from the rest of the dragons. Also, later on, I find the scene where Sheepstealer brings 2 sheep, one for him and one for Rhaena, pretty cute. It's a nice little scene to show how their bond is progressing. Moving past those scenes, I think episode 1 does an excellent job of getting the story moving again. One thing I appreciated was how efficiently the episode reintroduced everyone after the break between seasons. We quickly check in on the major players, reminding viewers where everyone is without making it feel like a long recap. I've seen some people criticize this approach, but I actually think it was necessary. With so many storylines happening at once, the episode needed to re-establish the political landscape before throwing us back into the conflict. We also see Rhaenyra trying to convince her council that Alicent's intentions were genuine, while ironically, Alicent herself hasn't even managed to accomplish the plan she set in motion. It's a nice bit of dramatic irony because the audience understands that both sides are operating on incomplete information, which only pushes the conflict further toward disaster. And all of that careful setup eventually leads to what I think is easily the highlight of the episode, the Battle of the Gullet. Before I get into the battle itself, I also want to mention one of the quieter moments beforehand. The conversation between Alan and Lord Corlys, trying to repair their relationship, was excellent. It adds an emotional layer to everything that's about to happen. Instead of feeling like just another battle, it feels like the culmination of personal conflicts that have been building for multiple seasons. But now, let's talk about the battle. Man, what a sequence, holy cow. It felt like somebody took Pirates of the Caribbean and dropped it into the Game of Thrones universe. And as someone whose favorite movie series is Pirates of the Caribbean, I absolutely loved it. From a visual standpoint, this is probably the most impressive battle the show has produced so far. The scale feels enormous, the dragons carry a real sense of weight, and the CGI is some of the best we've seen in either House of the Dragon or even Game of Thrones. More importantly though, the visuals don't just look expensive, they make the battle feel chaotic without ever becoming difficult to follow. You can tell an incredible amount of time and production value went into making every shot feel cinematic. But what really makes the battle work is that it isn't just spectacle for the sake of spectacle. The episode spends enough time establishing what's at stake beforehand that every loss during the battle actually means something. Starting the battle with Corlys knowing he's heavily outnumbered immediately raises the tension. Before anyone even draws a sword, you already know he's fighting from a disadvantage. I also thought the boarding combat was really well done. My only complaint is that I wish the camera cuts during some of the hand-to-hand fighting had been just a little slower. There were moments where the editing moved so quickly that I couldn't fully appreciate the choreography. At the same time, I understand why they did it. Between ships catching fire, dragons flying overhead, soldiers fighting on multiple decks, those faster cuts help sell just how overwhelming the situation is. One moment I absolutely loved was when Vermax gets tangled up by one of those giant anchor launchers. Seeing another dragon come in to help free him was something we really haven't seen before. Usually, dragon scenes revolve around dragons fighting each other, or burning armies below them. Here, we actually get to see dragons helping each other survive in the middle of combat, and I thought that added a really cool new dynamic to the battle. Another aspect of the battle that really stood out to me was Sheepstealer attacking both sides while Reyna desperately tried to stop him. It reminded everyone that, despite having a rider now, Sheepstealer is still a wild dragon. This meme I saw that someone made was pretty funny. It raises a good point though. Sheepstealer may not even be able to understand what Reyna is saying. It's like asking a wild dog to obey commands and getting mad when he doesn't obey them, but he's never heard or learned them before. The point is, he's acting on instinct, not on strategy. What I also found interesting is the question the episode quietly raises. When Reyna and Sheepstealer first see the battle in the distance, who's really making the decision to fly there? Reyna tells them they have to help, but was Sheepstealer already flying toward the battle on his own? Or did he actually obey her? If the theory that he can't understand Reyna to begin with is true, I bet he just went on his own. Personally, I like the idea that he wasn't listening to her at all. I think it makes the situation far more tragic because it means Reyna isn't responsible for what happens. She's just completely powerless to stop it. It reinforces that this isn't a fully trained dragon following commands. It's still a wild animal caught in the middle of a war. I also really enjoyed everything involving Corlys during the battle. I loved how once Lohar's flagship rammed Corlys' ship, the enemy soldiers came swinging across the masts. It was such a cool visual, and something we really haven't seen much of in this universe. The setting itself also made the fight feel unique. As the ship breaks apart and begins sinking, suddenly the environment becomes just as dangerous as the enemy. Characters are forced to fight in floating lower decks, on collapsing platforms, and even underwater. It's a really creative way of making the battle feel different from every other large-scale fight we've seen. Then there's the moment where Corlys falls into the water, and Alan immediately yells, "Father!" I love that moment because it shows that despite everything between them, despite all the resentment and complicated history, Alan still genuinely cares about him. It's a small line, but it says a lot about their relationship. And then Lohar and Alan's fight on the submerged lower deck was another standout sequence. We've seen plenty of fights throughout Game of Thrones, but we've never really seen one take place inside a sinking ship where the environment itself is constantly changing. And then there's Jace. Oh boy. I know some people are going to disagree with me here, but I actually think his death was necessary. Whenever a show is centered around large-scale war, there has to be a meaningful loss. There just has to be. If every major character survives every battle, eventually the stakes disappear. So I'm obviously not saying I'm glad Jace died, because I really liked his character, but I do think his death is one of the biggest reasons this battle is as impactful as it is. What makes it work isn't just the shock, it's who Jace is. He's fighting because he wants to protect his mother and do what he believes is right. That's why his death hurts so much. It isn't some grand heroic sacrifice. It's sudden, brutal, and it's unfair. One second it looks like he might actually survive, then almost instantly, he's struck down before anyone can save him. It perfectly captures one of the show's biggest themes. In war, nobody is invincible. Now, as much as I love this episode, it definitely isn't perfect. I have a few criticisms, but honestly, there aren't many, and that's one of the reasons I think this is one of the strongest episodes the series has produced. The biggest issue, and one that I've seen a lot of people point out, is the scene where Sir Laurent refuses to let Rhaenyra leave after Jace flies off to battle. I just don't buy it. Knights of the Queen's Guard are supposed to have unwavering loyalty, so in one of the most critical moments of the war, it doesn't make much sense to me that Sir Laurent would completely ignore a direct order from his queen because Jace told him to. Now, I can't think of one possible explanation. Earlier in the episode, everyone who heard Alicent's proposal believed it was a trap, and maybe Laurent thought Rhaenyra wasn't thinking clearly because she desperately wanted to believe peace was still possible. But even then, I don't think that would be enough for him to outright deny her command. What it really felt like is that the scene needed Rhaenyra to stay in that room, so that's what happened. And that brings me to what I think is an even bigger problem. Rhaenyra wasn't actually trapped. Like seriously, at all. There's a giant window right behind her. There are multiple exits from the room. While I was watching, I kept thinking, why doesn't she just leave? Even if climbing out the window wasn't realistic, she could have simply tried another door. So Laurent had no realistic way of informing every other Queen's Guard member that he intended to keep the Queen confined. If she had reached another exit, I don't see why another guard would have stopped her from leaving. It creates the feeling that she's trapped because the script needs her to be trapped, not because the situation naturally leaves her with no options. Anyways, moving on. Why the heck did we need an Aemon kissing his mom scene? I mean seriously, what purpose did this actually serve? When I first watched it, my immediate reaction was just, what the heck am I looking at? Now, to be fair, showrunner Ryan Condal later explained that the kiss wasn't meant to be romantic. According to him, it was supposed to symbolize Eamon asserting dominance over Allison and proving that he's no longer the little boy she could manipulate. It's meant to show that the balance of power between them has completely shifted. I understand the intention, for sure. I just don't think the execution was the best way to communicate that, because there are countless ways this show could have established Eamon's authority. He could have refused her advice, he could have publicly overruled her, he could have simply looked her in the eyes and said, "You don't control me anymore, Mom." Instead, he kissed his mom. And for a scene that's supposed to communicate political dominance, that's such a bizarre creative choice that it immediately pulls me out of the episode. It doesn't make me think, wow, Eamon has become more powerful. It makes me think, why did the writers think that this was the best way to get that point across? Another criticism is much smaller, but it stuck out to me. Why does Lord Corlys present his ship broadside when Lohar's ship is equipped with a reinforced ram? He's one of the greatest naval commanders in Westerosi history. You think his first instinct would be to use one of his ship's biggest advantages instead of exposing its side to the enemy fleet. Maybe there's a tactical explanation I'm missing, but on first watch it felt a little odd. And finally, can we talk about the scorpions for a second? How do these things suddenly have aimbot? These dragons are flying at high speed, changing direction constantly, and yet they're still getting shot by these flippant scorpions. And it's not even like dragon hunting is some common military exercise. There aren't enough dragons around for armies to regularly practice using these weapons. So while I understand the scorpions need to be a threat for dramatic purposes, their accuracy sometimes stretches my suspension of disbelief a little too far. But honestly, those are relatively minor complaints. None of them were enough to take away from what I thought was an incredible episode. Episode 1 delivered fantastic visuals, meaningful character moments, and one of the best battles we've seen in the franchise, and left me genuinely excited for where the season was heading, which is exactly why what happened in episode 2 disappointed me as much as it did. So yeah, let's move on to episode 2. I want to start with the positives before I get into the reasons this episode disappointed me. And honestly, the opening is fantastic. Watching Rhaenyra finally realize that Jace is dead was probably the emotional high point of the episode. The acting by Emma D'Arcy was phenomenal. What I loved mostly was how naturally the grief unfolded. She doesn't immediately collapse into tears. First, she's in denial, almost refusing to believe what she's seeing. Then that denial turns into anger. And only after that does everything completely break down into uncontrollable sobbing. It feels incredibly real. After episode 1 ended, I remember thinking, oh man, Rhaenyra is going to lose it when she finds out. So there was this sense of anticipation leading into the scene, and I think that made the emotional payoff hit even harder. One little thing I found kind of funny though, was Sir Lawrence trying to pull Rhaenyra away from Jace's body, while she's desperately trying to wake him up. Like, dude, she already wants you dead after stopping her from leaving Dragonstone, and now you're grabbing her while she's grieving her son? Bold strategy, my friend. I mean, shoot, that's crazy. Later on, we get the scene where Rhaena asks Lady Jane Arryn if she and Sheepstealer can stay in the Vale. And honestly, I'm really glad Jen said no. It would have been incredibly easy for the writers to have her agree simply because Rhaena is one of the protagonists. But saying no is actually the decision that makes the most sense here. Back in season 2, Jane made it very clear that she would only commit the Vale's army if Rhaenyra sent a dragon to protect them. Instead, Rhaenyra sent 3 dragon eggs and Rhaena to babysit them. Understandably, Lady Arryn wasn't thrilled. Now imagine you're Lady Arryn after the Battle of the Gullet. A wild dragon that just attacked both sides of a massive naval battle suddenly wants to live right next to your castle. Why would you ever agree to that? Not only is Sheepstealer unpredictable, but if Aemon ever learns where he is, the Vale instantly becomes a target. It's one of those moments where the logical decision also happens to be the one that creates more conflict, and I appreciated that. Then there's Daemon. I don't know what it is, but this man is unintentionally one of the funniest characters in the show. First, he's just casually messing around with Jason Lannister's severed head like it's a normal Tuesday. Then he's walking around giving everybody these smug little smirks. Matt Smith somehow manages to make Daemon intimidating and completely unhinged, while also making me laugh. One scene that genuinely got me was when Daemon returns to Dragonstone, sees all the dragon riders just standing around, and basically goes, "What the flip are y'all doing here?" That was my reaction too. It was kind of a nice payoff, because during the previous episode, everyone just waiting around for Vhagar, and then them leaving after getting scared in the woods, felt a little dumb to me. Having Daemon immediately question it almost felt like the show acknowledging what a lot of viewers were probably thinking. I also really liked the quieter conversation between Corlys and Alan after the battle. After everything they've been through together, finally hearing Corlys give Alan his name was a genuinely emotional moment. It wasn't some huge dramatic speech. It was simple, and I think that's exactly why it worked. It finally feels like Corlys is accepting him as his son, rather than pretending that relationship doesn't exist. Hopefully that's the end of the tension between them, because I really enjoyed watching those two finally start acting like family. The last positive I wanted to mention is actually more of an interesting mystery than anything else. Helena has always seemed to possess some kind of prophetic ability, so whenever she says something strange, I immediately start paying attention. This time she says,
"This is strange. It isn't the season."
Now, I honestly have no idea what she means, but I would be shocked if that line isn't foreshadowing something later in the season. One theory I've seen floating around is that she could be hinting that Rhaenyra's reign on the Iron Throne won't last very long, that she's taken the throne at the wrong time. Personally, I don't know if that's what the line means, but I do think it's a fun theory, and I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it as the season continues. Now, moving into episode 2's flaws, I'm going to go through the flaws in roughly chronological order. And what stood out to me throughout this episode is that a lot of these issues come back to the same pattern. Important moments either happen off screen, resolve too quickly, or don't feel fully earned in the moment. The first thing that confused me was how Baela recovered Jace's body. At the end of episode 1, we clearly see him sinking deep underwater after being killed in the battle. It's actually a really powerful final image. He doesn't just die, he disappears into the sea as the chaos continues above him. But then episode 2 opens, and his body is already back at Dragonstone. Now, I understand there are possible explanations. Maybe after the battle ended, his body floated back to the surface. Maybe Moondancer spotted him. Maybe Baela spent time searching the battlefield afterward and eventually found him. Those explanations could make sense, but the issue is the show never shows us any of that process. And because Jace is such a major character, and his death is one of the most important consequences of episode 1, skipping over the recovery makes the moment feel less impactful than it should be. We don't feel the aftermath, we just skip straight to the result. Almost the same issue happens again with Adam of Hull finding Lord Corlys out at sea. We're talking about a massive ocean, filled with wreckage, smoke, debris, and survivors scattered everywhere after a huge battle. Yet Sea Smoke somehow manages to locate Corlys floating alone in the water almost immediately. But the show doesn't explain it. And when you have multiple major rescues, like this happening off screen or without setup, it starts to feel less like we're watching consequences unfold, and more like we're being moved from one plot point to the next without seeing how we got there. Then there's the escape of Larys and Aegon. This is another moment that feels overly convenient. The scene basically relies on chaos breaking out at the exact right moment so that guards are distracted and the two of them can slip away unnoticed. But instead of feeling like they outsmarted the situation or narrowly escaped through clever planning, it feels like the environment itself just solved the problem for them. The guards don't fail them because of a mistake or a weakness in security, they fail them because the story needs them to be somewhere else for a moment, and that's what makes it feel a bit unearned. Another moment I wish had more weight is Corlys seeing Driftmark burning in the distance. This is not just any castle, this is the seat of House Valyrian, his home, his legacy, and the center of everything he has built over his entire life. But the scene moves past it very quickly. We see the fire, we see his reaction, and then we immediately move on. What's missing is the emotional aftermath, the quiet moment where we actually sit with what the loss actually means for him. Because this should be one of the most devastating personal moments in the episode, but it doesn't really get time to land. One thing I've noticed throughout the show is that Alicent often seems to be placed into increasingly traumatic situations, sometimes without much narrative payoff. The earlier scene with the soldiers already felt unnecessary to me, but the Wilde confrontation is where the writing becomes more questionable. From what I can tell, the idea is that Lord Wilde believes he can use what he knows about Alicent to sexually assault her and essentially political blackmail. But when you actually break it down, the plan doesn't really hold up. Alicent isn't a minor noble with no protection. She's the Queen Mother. She still has political influence, allies within the court, and direct access to power. So even if Wilde succeeds in pressuring her in that moment, it's unclear what his long-term plan is. Because the second she reports what happened or even quietly mentions it to the wrong person, his life is essentially over. And that's what makes the scene feel off. It's not just that it's uncomfortable or morally disturbing, because it definitely is. It's that it doesn't feel strategically believable within the political world the show has established. In earlier seasons, manipulation usually worked through slow pressure, alliances, and long-term positioning. Here, it feels like the character jumps straight to an extreme action without a realistic safety net, which makes the scene feel more like it exists to create tension than to naturally evolve from character logic. And this leads into my biggest issue with the episode. How does Rhaenyra manage to get into King's Landing so easily? Even without Vhagar present, the Red Keep is still one of the most heavily defended castles in Westeros. It should not be easy to breach under any circumstances. But Rhaenyra and Daemon somehow push their way through the city and into the throne room with very little resistance. And to me, the issue isn't just that they succeed, it's how little friction there is along the way. Even Daemon, who is established as one of the most dangerous fighters in the entire series, moves through trained soldiers without ever really being pushed to his limit. There's no sense of exhaustion, there's no sense of near failure, no moment where things feel like they might actually go wrong, and because of that, the tension drops. It stops feeling like a desperate high-risk invasion. It starts feeling like a guaranteed sequence of events that has to happen for the plot to progress, and it was really disappointing. And I actually think there was a much stronger way to handle this sequence. You could still have Damon fight his way through the castle, but every encounter costs him something. For example, he gets cut, he gets slowed down, he's visibly struggling by the time they reach deeper into the Red Keep. The guards don't feel like obstacles he easily clears, they feel like pressure that gradually wears him down. By the time they reach the throne room, he's exhausted and barely standing. But he keeps going because he's completely driven by the idea of getting Rhaenyra to the Iron Throne. Instead of everything being handed to her, the final Kingsguard actually becomes a real obstacle. Rhaenyra is forced into a moment where she has to make a decision under pressure, and only after that struggle does she finally sit on the Iron Throne. My idea there was maybe an injured Kingsguard comes at Rhaenyra, and then maybe she pushes them into the swords that make up the Iron Throne, kind of symbolizing her transition into ruthlessness, showing that she's done whatever she had to do to get to the Iron Throne. That version doesn't change the outcome, but it makes it feel earned. Let me know what y'all think of that in the comments. I also thought the execution scene of Otto was not done well. I would have really liked to see a more determined Rhaenyra in this moment. Someone who is willing to do whatever is necessary to secure her position on the Iron Throne after everything that she's given up. Instead, what we get is a version of her that feels emotionally overwhelmed. She's visibly weeping before the execution, and then even struggles to cleanly sever Otto's head on the first attempt. And for me, that moment didn't come across as powerful or emotional in a meaningful way. It just made her feel physically and emotionally uncertain in front of everyone watching. It felt less like a commanding ruler making a difficult decision, and more like someone who isn't fully in control of the situation. The other issue I have is the speed of the decision itself. Why does she act so quickly? It feels like she allows herself to be pushed into it by Daemon without really stopping to consider whether it's the right political move in that exact moment. Because the execution doesn't just remove Otto, it also completely undermines the quiet understanding and fragile political balance Rhaenyra has been trying to maintain with Alicent. If that agreement is supposed to mean anything, then killing Otto like this immediately puts it at risk. And from a strategic standpoint, it feels incredibly short-sighted. It also raises another question. If the goal is to project power, why do it in a private room with maybe 100 people present, instead of making it a public execution where thousands can witness it? For a character who has been at the center of the story since the beginning, shaping so many of the political events that led us here, the moment just doesn't have the scale or weight it feels like it should. Otto's death should feel like a turning point in Westeros, not just another scene that comes and goes. And because of that, I never really felt the emotional impact of it, which is disappointing, because he's a character who has been central to the entire conflict from the very beginning. The final moment that really didn't work for me was Rhaenyra walking up to the Iron Throne immediately after, visibly crying the entire time. And I remember thinking, after everything you've been through, this is the moment where you should be channeling everything into determination, not breaking down in front of everyone. But instead, she looks like someone who doesn't even fully want the throne anymore. One thing I will say I did like is the visual of the blood footprints leading up to the Iron Throne. It's a really strong symbolic detail, and it shows the cost of the path she's taken to get there. But even that idea is undermined a bit by the emotional tone of the scene, because instead of feeling like a powerful arrival, it feels hesitant and uncertain. And that's really why the scene didn't work for me. It's not that emotion doesn't belong there, it's that the emotion doesn't feel controlled or directed in a way that matches the moment. But anyways, I just found the scene pretty underwhelming for something that should have been one of the most important moments of the episode. And that's really my problem with episode 2. It has good moments, but not enough of them feel fully earned, and that's where it loses me compared to episode 1. So overall, episode 2 isn't a bad episode on its own. There are still strong performances, some really well acted emotional moments, and a few scenes that I genuinely enjoyed watching. But when I compare to episode 1, the difference really comes down to one thing for me. Episode 1 made its biggest moments feel earned. The battles, the emotional reactions, the consequences, everything felt like it had a build-up behind it. Episode 2, on the other hand, often relies more on convenience. Important moments happen off-screen, conflicts resolve a bit too easily, and some of the biggest story moments don't always feel like they've been fully built up or deserved. And that's what made the drop-off so noticeable for me, because episode 1 didn't just set a high bar for action and storytelling, it set an expectation that the show was going to take its time and earn its big moments. Episode 2 didn't fully meet that same standard. I still have hope for the rest of the season, because when the show gets it right, it gets it pretty darn good. But after an episode like this, I'm just hoping the next one leans more into what made episode 1 so strong in the first place. If y'all enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe, comment down below any theories or thoughts that you have, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.